Assamese nationalists claim that so many people from Bangladeshi territory entered, Assam, that the demography is changing. And after this led to something called the Nelly massacre in 83, where about 2,000 people, according to official figures, were slaughtered in broad daylight for 6 hours.
This is Dr. Rudabeh Shahid, a non-resident research fellow at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council and a senior consultant and advisor at the European Institute for International Law and International Relations. Currently, she is a post-doctoral research fellow in the Department of Politics at the University of York. Dr. Shahid's research is broadly about the history and dynamics of refugee crises, both past and present. Recently, her research has focused on the ongoing Rohingya refugee crisis, as well as issues of statelessness in India's northeastern state of Assam. In a recent article, Dr. Shahid examined the similarities between the ongoing Rohingya refugee crisis and the historical Bengal refugee crisis, the displacement of roughly 10 million people in 1971 after the Pakistan military began a crackdown in what was once its eastern wing. For the second installment in our series on the 1971 war, Surj spoke to Dr. Shahid about both the history of the two crises, their shared roots in British colonialism, as well as their impacts on the political landscape of present-day India and Myanmar.
Here at the University of York, I am part of a project called Rethinking Civil Society. And in that project, there's a segment called Civil Society in Post-Partition India. And so this paper that I will be talking about, which I wrote with my colleague, and we are basically comparing the situation in 1971 with the Bangladesh War of Independence and the situation of the Rohingya crisis, the ongoing Rohingya crisis. What we argued is the refugee crisis in both cases were triggered by events during partition.
The refugee crises in both Bengal and Myanmar were fueled by divisions that were cemented under British colonial rule. Dr. Shahid explained how the divide and rule policy of the British colonial empire set the stage for disaster down the line.
The British, created dissension between different groups of people. So there was, the divide and rule, informal and formal policy. The British, when they came to the region, they wanted to know what kind of people were living there. So, for example, their languages, their religions. So once census was done, people who were in a majority in one place, they started behaving a little differently. And people who were minority in a certain place, they figured out, oh, so we are the minorities. And this led to, in certain places, the British promoting sometimes the minorities, sometimes the majorities, and creating dissension. And we see that both in the what is now East Pakistan with the Bengali Muslims versus the Bengali Hindus, and also in the Rakhine province. Bengali Hindus were promoted because the official language at that time was Persian when the British took over with the Battle of Plassey. And then when it was changed to English, it was not seen as a religious language or having any religious connotations for the Hindu population. So they adopted the British mode of education, while the Muslim elites did not. And the Muslims in this province, most of them were of a peasant population. And the taxes were collected from them by the landlords, who were largely Hindus. And they gave it to the British, of course. And so the landlords had a lot of power. And so during this time, there was this Hindu and Muslim divide. Also, this divide and rule policy played out very much in Burma. So in the Rakhine province, for example, there were the Buddhist Rakhine people versus the Rohingyas. There used to be a separate kingdom. There was a kind of coexistence. But then the Burmese took over, and then the British took over. And what had happened is that, when the Japanese occupied Burma during World War II, minorities such as, the Rohingya Muslims sided with the British. while the Buddhists sided with the Japanese. The reason that the Rohingyas Muslims sided with the British was that they were more represented in the army. So in terms of ruling Burma, the Bamar Buddhists were not promoted in administration in the armed forces by the British, while the ethnic minorities such as the Rohingyas were promoted. So we see this thing playing out as well. There was the idea of divide and rule. And of course, in both the cases of the creation of Bangladesh and the Rohingya, the Rohingya crisis, there was a lot of refugees, of course.
Over 1 million Rohingya refugees have fled violence in Myanmar in successive waves of displacement since the late 1970s. The latest exodus began in 2017, when over 800,000 people sought refuge in Bangladesh after violence broke out yet again in Myanmar's Rakhine state. Dr. Shahid told us about the centuries-old history underlying this long and protracted crisis.
There was the Burmese Empire, which was way in the east, and then there was the Rakhine Kingdom, and then there was the Mughal Empire, which was on the west. So the Rakhine Kingdom was kind of a buffer between the Buddhist Empire and the Mughal Empire. And what happened is in the late 1700s, the Burmese Empire, took over the Rakhine Buddhist Empire. So both were Buddhists. Later on, what happened after the Treaty of Yandabu in 1826, the British they fought against the Burmese, and then they took over not just the whole of Burma but also this Rakhine province. When the British took over this territory, they came up with this the census, which said that there are 135 indigenous ethnic groups in Myanmar, and this left out the Rohingyas, who were thought of as people who are from the Chittagong region, have ancestry from the Chittagong region. What happened is that in Burma, the British promoted some of the smaller ethnic groups. For example, the Rohingyas. And they were given better posts, for example, in administration. Burma gained independence in January 48. When the Burmese constitution was created in 48, this 135 clause of this 135 indigenous ethnic group being the original residents, that was adopted in the constitution. And this created dissension with people who were left out, in this case the Rohingyas. In 78 there was a military crackdown in the Rakhine province, especially in the Rohingya dominated majority areas. And in 82, when this clause was implemented in terms of who's indigenous and who's not, they were their citizenship was taken away, so they became disenfranchised. So after that, they had problems in accessing, say, universities. They had limited access to healthcare. They had limited access to, going from one village to another. So mobility was restricted, and their indicators became very low over the years. In 92, there was a crackdown, and a lot of people entered Bangladeshi territory, what is now, the Cox's Bazar region, and about 200,000 people. And then the UNHCR could convince, the Myanmar government to take back some of these people. A lot of them went back, but then a lot of them returned because there were future crackdowns. Before this entry of the Rohingyas in 2017 to Bangladesh, this influx, there were already about 200,000 to 300,000 Rohingyas in Bangladesh. So over a few years, there are about 1.1 million people who have entered Bangladeshi territory, and most of them are living in refugee camps. The largest one is Kutupalong, which is, by the way, the largest refugee camp in the world.
While the Rohingya refugee crisis has consisted of waves of displacement over a period of 40 years, The Bengal refugee crisis mostly played out over the course of 9 months in 1971, when an estimated 10 million refugees crossed the border from what was then East Pakistan into India. This marked the largest single displacement of refugees in the second half of the 20th century. Dr. Shahid walked us through the events of the crisis.
If we go now to East Pakistan in 71, the Bengalis also felt, if I may use this word, pissed off or not very happy, because in November 1970, there was a tidal bore where about 100,000 people were killed in this region called Bhola, the Bhola cyclone. And then there was a delay in relief operations, and so East Pakistan really felt marginalized. The Awami League, unfortunately, was not allowed to form office. And then we know in March there was a crackdown, and then that led to a full-fledged war. In 9 months, there were refugees, about 10 million refugees that entered states of India bordering what is now Bangladesh, what used to be East Pakistan. The people who fled initially are mainly the Awami Leaguers, people in the political establishment. But then the whole thing became targeted towards Hindus because, it was seen that the Hindus were, seen as collaborators with India. But then it doesn't end there. Bengali culture, in many sense, also, for Bengali Muslims, there are many symbols. For example, the bindi, Bengali Muslim women wear that. So there were also ideas that, the Bengali Muslims are not really as Islamized or more, they're still now Hinduized. Many Pakistani generals and political leaders have said that. Initially, the crackdowns happened in the cities, say in Dhaka and Chittagong, but then it went on to the villages. When it went on to the villages, as in the case of the Rohingyas, how would we know who are, Awami League, sympathizers, or who to attack, or where people are hiding? It's a very different terrain in Bengal. They needed local collaborators to help. So then we find local collaborators in especially the village areas saying that, okay, these are the people who should be killed. And that, that led to, a lot of, local people, villagers being attacked. There are stories of people, praying, and then there was a brush fire, during congregations. And then it was, pretty much the whole country running for, shelter into all these places in India. Largely, West Bengal, which has the biggest border with Bangladesh.
Even though the 1971 refugee crisis was not as protracted as the Rohingya refugee crisis, it cast a long shadow, leaving Bengalis who fled to India indefinitely vulnerable. Dr. Shahid talked us through the continuing impact of the crisis, especially on Indian politics.
So Bangladesh, at least the official claim is that everybody returned from India. And the Indian establishment and many people say that not everybody has returned. So the story is probably somewhere in the middle. So if we start off from West Bengal, yes, that was the biggest border. But then a lot of people entered these other, areas where the majority population are not ethnically Bengalis. So that has created issues with people who are there, who are the locals, or if I may use the word, indigenous. This whole politics of Northeast India has been around that who's indigenous and who's not. Basically, Bengalis versus other people. So there is this one state of India which is in the eastern. If you go further east of Bangladesh, it's called Tripura, which used to be a princely state. Many Bengali refugees entered, and now that state is 70% Bengali and 30% tribal. So the whole demography has changed since 71. And in Assam, this other state which borders Tripura and borders West Bengal, the north of Bangladesh, this is one area where they're having elections now. the Assamese nationalists told Mrs. Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, that, okay, so you can have the elections, but after creating, after detecting who is a foreigner and who is not. But Mrs. Gandhi still had elections in Assam. And then that did not go well with the Assamese nationalists. And then they attacked this one place where there's predominantly, this Bengali Muslims used to live. And there was a bloodbath for 6 hours called, that's known as the Nelly massacre. And after, this massacre, the Nelly massacre, by that time, Mrs. Gandhi had passed away. Her son, Rajiv Gandhi, became the prime minister. Then the Assamese nationalists and the center, led by Rajiv Gandhi, had a treaty called the Assam Accord, where they said that they would create a national register of citizenship. So the National Register of Citizenship is basically like a list to find out who are the real residents of Assam and who are not. So who are the Indian citizens and who are not, who are outsiders. That did not really get implemented pretty much until the advent of, the BJP in Assam in 2016. Then they had a push for it. They published it in 2019 and 1.9 million people were left out. But this was also a problem for the BJP because they had hoped that more Muslim names than Hindu names would show up. But this did not happen. 60% of the names that did not, were not featured in the NRC, this registry of citizenship, were Hindus, and the rest 40% were Muslims. That's where the BJP passed this bill in the Indian Parliament called the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 in December. So what it gave was that it gave the Bengali Hindus a faster track or a route to citizenship. So the most vulnerable people are now the Bengali Muslims of Assam. And now throughout the rest of India, because the BJP said that, so now we had this brilliant test case of NRC in Assam, we are going to implement it throughout the rest of India. And the thing is that if, for example, if you are a Muslim in North India and if your name does not feature in the NRC, you just cannot be pushed across the border to Bangladesh. But for example, if you're in West Bengal, that can happen, you're right on the border. So the Bengali Muslims, not just in Assam who are already vulnerable, also now in West Bengal, which has a population, by the way, of 30 million Muslims. During the electoral campaign, the re-electoral campaign, if I may say, of Mr. Modi in 2019, Bangladeshi Muslims in India were called, because there are a lot of Bangladeshi laborers in India, according to intelligence reports, about 15 to 20 million. Who's now the Home Minister, who used to head the BJP, he called them as termites. So this is how 71 and the refugee crisis is playing out in Indian politics.